Welcome. Today we are digging into a really fascinating framework from our illustrative sermon by Pastor Francis Ansary, one that claims it can explain the root of all our world's problems. It's a huge claim, so let's get right into it and see how it works. Let's start with this question. Think about it. What if one single idea could actually explain everything from personal arguments all the way up to international wars? Well, the message from Pastor we are exploring today suggests that there is such an idea. And this framework is built around what Pastor calls prophetic trends. The key here is that these are supposed to happen in a very specific order. What we are going to do is walk through the logic of this framework, starting right at the very beginning with its absolute foundation. And that foundation is deception. Now, the core argument here is that deception isn't just one problem among many. In this framework, it is the master key, the one thing that has to happen first to unlock all other problems we see in the world. And this quote just cuts right to the heart of the argument. The illustrative sermon is incredibly clear on the point. Evil actions don't just spring out of nowhere. They are always preceded by a person or a group of people believing in a lie. It's a really powerful and direct claim. To really get what kind of deception we are talking about, Pastor used a very specific term, the spirit of Antichrist. And check out the definition here because it's super important. The goal isn't just to fight against the truth, it's to offer a counterfeit, a compelling replacement for it. So here's where it gets really interesting. The framework argues that this deception always starts at the highest possible level. The pastor actually calls the knowledge of God the ABC of human knowledge. The logic is pretty straightforward. If you can get someone to believe a lie about the most fundamental truth of existence, then deceiving them about anything else becomes a piece of cake. So if the deception is the big overarching concept, how exactly does it operate? The framework breaks it down into two main types. On one side, you have spiritual deception. That is the what. It is about corrupting who or what we worship. The root of that is something Pastor calls idolatry. Then on the other side, you have theological deception, the how. These are all the teachings and bad ideas that justify false worship. So, one changes what you worship, and the other gives you the intellectual permission to do it. Now I know what you're thinking. Idolatry? It sounds kind of ancient, right? Like something out of a history book. But let's look at how the illustrative sermon makes this idea completely relevant to our modern world. This framework takes the idea of idolatry way beyond just statues. It defines it as whatever you magnify in your heart, whatever becomes your ultimate source of meaning, your final authority on what's right and wrong. And here are some of the modern day examples Pastor gives. When the endless pursuit of money, power, food, or pleasure becomes the absolute center of your life, the thing you organize everything else around. Well, in this framework, that is modern idolatry. So this is the big leap. How does this internal thing, which is deception and idolatry, happening inside a person's heart, lead to something as big and external as global conflict? Well, this sermon lays out a very direct step-by-step chain of events. And the chain reaction starts right here. Idolatry, it says, is the root of covetousness. When you see yourself, your desires, or your group as the ultimate authority in the universe, you start to believe you're entitled to whatever you want, even if it belongs to someone else. The pastor actually points to this biblical passage to back up the point. The argument is that the wars out there in the world are really just a bigger version of the wars happening in here, inside of us, our own desires running wild. Here's the entire sequence laid out perfectly. 1. Idolatry, where a person or group makes themselves the center of their own universe. 2. Covetousness, they start what isn't theirs. 3. Breaking boundaries, they begin ignoring the rights of others. And 4. Conflict, the final and inevitable result. And what's really wild about this framework is that the pastor says this is a totally scalable pattern. This exact same four-step process explains everything from a small family argument to clashes between cultures, all the way up to a full-blown international war. Same logic, just different scales. So let's tie it all together. What we've just unpacked is a worldview that looks at all the huge, messy, complicated problems of our world and says they aren't actually separate issues. Instead, it sees them all as different symptoms of one single underlying root cause, a fundamental deception about who or what gets to be God. Every worldview, whether it's based on economics, history, or a framework like this one, offers its own diagnosis for what's wrong with the world. And that really just leaves us with one final question to think about for ourselves. What's yours?